Detroit, Michigan, 1903–1970s. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was no city on Earth that represented progress more clearly than Detroit, Michigan. In 1903, a small automotive company called the Ford Motor Company opened its doors. Within a decade, Detroit was no longer just a city, it was an idea, speed, innovation, the future. By 1913, Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line, and everything changed. Cars became cheaper, production exploded, jobs multiplied, and Detroit became the beating heart of American industry. People didn't move to Detroit hopping to survive. They moved there expecting to win. The city that built the modern world. By the 1920s, Detroit was booming. Factories ran day and night. Smoke rose constantly from massive plants that stretched for miles. Entire neighborhoods were built around work schedules. If the factories were running, the city was alive. By 1950, Detroit reached its peak. Population, 1.85 million people. One of the highest average incomes in the United States. Home to General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. A city where a single factory job could buy a house, raise a family, and promise stability. Detroit didn't just produce cars. It produced certainty. Progress accelerates. But progress doesn't stop once it starts. By the 1950s and 1960s, the same innovations that made Detroit powerful began reshaping the world around it. Automation reduced the need for labor. Highways encouraged suburban expansion. Manufacturing became more efficient and less local. Factories that once needed tens of thousands of workers suddenly needed far fewer. And slowly, quietly, the math changed. Detroit had been built for growth, not adaptation. The first cracks. The warning signs were visible before they were acknowledged. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act accelerated suburban sprawl. Workers no longer needed to live near factories. Wealth moved outward. Tax bases followed. Then came foreign competition. By the late 1960s, Japanese and European automakers were producing smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles. Detroit's industry was powerful, but rigid. Progress elsewhere moved faster. Detroit stayed heavy. A city too specialized to pivot. Detroit had been designed around one idea: automobiles. Entire districts existed for a single purpose. Neighborhoods depended on a single employer. Schools, transport, housing, all optimized for an industrial machine that assumed constant expansion. When that machine slowed, there was no backup plan. Progress didn't destroy Detroit. It outgrew it. The moment everything shifted. In 1967, civil unrest shook the city. It wasn't the cause of Detroit's decline, but it accelerated what was already happening. Businesses left, insurance rates rose, investment slowed. Then in the 1970s, oil crises hit. Demand shifted overnight. Manufacturing costs climbed. Automation increased again. Factories closed. One by one. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough to change everything. When the future leaves first. By 1980, Detroit's population had dropped below 1.2 million. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Houses were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they were no longer needed. Progress moved on. Detroit stayed behind. And the city that once defined the future now faced an uncomfortable question. What happens to a place built for progress when progress no longer needs it? By the early 1970s, the illusion was gone. Detroit was no longer racing toward the future, it was trying to keep up with it. What followed was not a single collapse, but a slow, grinding unraveling that stretched across decades. When the jobs disappeared, the most damaging change came quietly. Factories didn't explode. They didn't burn down. They simply closed. Between 1970 and 1990, Detroit lost hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. Automation replaced labor. Production shifted overseas. Entire plants that once employed tens of thousands shut their gates for the last time. For a city built almost entirely around one industry, this wasn't a downturn. It was structural failure. A worker could lose a job, but Detroit lost its purpose. Population collapse. As employment vanished, people followed. By 2000, Detroit's population had dropped below 1 million for the first time in nearly a century. Entire neighborhoods emptied, schools closed, local businesses collapsed without customers to serve. What remained wasn't a shrinking city, it was a hollow one. Streetlights went dark. Public services struggled. Tax revenue evaporated. The infrastructure built for nearly 2 million people now served half that number. And it was unsustainable. The rise of the abandoned city. By the early 2000s, Detroit became a global symbol, not of industry, but of abandonment. Images of empty factories, crumbling schools, and overgrown neighborhoods spread across the world. Once grand buildings stood open to the elements. Blocks of homes sat silent. But these weren't ruins from war or disaster. They were leftovers from progress. Every abandoned structure represented a system that no longer fit the world it helped create. Bankruptcy, the breaking point. In 2013, Detroit reached a moment that once seemed impossible. The city filed for bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history at the time. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. Decades of declining revenue, rising costs, and deferred maintenance had finally caught up. The city could no longer support itself the way it once had. Progress had moved on, and Detroit had been left carrying the weight of its own past. A city that refused to vanish. And yet, Detroit did not disappear. That's the part often left out. In the years after bankruptcy, something unexpected happened. Investment returned selectively. Downtown areas were revitalized. New industries arrived. Artists, entrepreneurs, and developers saw opportunity where others saw decay. Detroit began to change again. Not back into what it was, but into something smaller, leaner, and different. Progress returned. But on new terms. The cost of reinvention. Still, the scars remain. Vast areas of the city never recovered. Some neighborhoods were never rebuilt. Population today sits around 630,000, nearly one-third of its peak. Detroit survived, but it paid for progress twice. First by building the future, then by being abandoned by it. The lesson Detroit leaves behind. Detroit's story isn't about failure. It's about specialization without adaptability. The city didn't fall because it stopped working. It fell because the world changed faster than it could. And that makes Detroit less of an exception and more of a warning. Because across the world, there are cities today built around one industry, one resource, one idea, all vulnerable to the same fate. Detroit was once the most powerful industrial city on Earth. It didn't collapse from neglect or disaster. It collapsed because progress moved forward and didn't look back. The city couldn't survive progress, not because it resisted change, but because it was shaped by a version of progress that no longer existed. And that is what makes Detroit's story so important. Because the future doesn't destroy cities. It simply stops needing them. If you want more documentaries about cities shaped, and sometimes broken, by progress, innovation, and history, subscribe to the channel. Because understanding the past isn't about nostalgia. It's about knowing what happens when the future arrives.